where both twins did. Now that kind of throws a big monkey wrench into the genetic link, because there really should be almost 100% connection there. So, and another thing to think about too, if it truly is a genetic link, why have the rates been going up so much? Because if you look at other disorders, they kind of stayed about the same, but autism in the last 20 years has gone up 600%. The diagnosis of autism has gone up 600%. So if it truly was just a genetic link, those numbers shouldn't be spiking like that, because genes don't mutate that fast. So it's just another thing to think about. And this is from that study. This is the lead author. And I like this quote from it. It said, "Our research shows that we need to be studying both genetic and environmental factors, as well as how they interact with each other. We need to explore all areas of environmental risks that are shared by both twin individuals and impact development of the child." So, I mean, they even recognize that, I mean, the information that they found is probably not showing that it is a true genetic link. And later on in that study, they also said that, you know, there could be a predisposed genetic trait that they have, and then something triggers that trait. And I mean, that's as far as they've gone with it, and that's kind of just still in the hypothesis area right now. But that could be something that, you know, maybe I've actually emailed this person a couple times and emailed my information to them. So, you know, who knows? Maybe they'll look at Lyme disease a little bit further. Here's just some more interesting statistics. Like I said earlier, in the 60s and 70s, it was about 1 in 10,000 people were diagnosed with autism. Today, it's about 1 in 100. In a population-based study in a Minnesota county, found that the incidence of autism grew 8-fold from 1980 to 1996. And I thought that one was interesting because it was in this one area of Minnesota that had a large number of Lyme disease cases during that same time. And it's just odd that this one particular area of Minnesota had such a high spike in autism, and it also had a lot of cases of Lyme disease. In countries in South America and Asia and the Middle East that really don't have a lot of cases of Lyme disease, they have much, much lower rates of autism than countries in Europe, because in Europe there's a lot of cases of Lyme disease. And actually in those South American, Asian, and Middle Eastern countries, their rates of autism are actually quite a bit lower than the United States as well. And like I said, autism spectrum disorders have increased 600% over the last 20 years. And then this is another interesting one. Boys are 5 times more likely to be diagnosed with autism than girls. And speaking with some other Lyme literate doctors, I mean, there's a lot of still unproven things with that, but I mean, just something very simple as what do little boys do? They go out and they play in the weeds. What do little girls do? They stay inside. I mean, that's just throwing out a hypothesis, but there is no reason why, or known reason why boys have such a much higher rate of diagnosis of autism than girls. Now, these are some other information that I found in my study. This was done by the University of California, Davis and the Mind Institute. They took blood samples of a control group of kids that were completely healthy and didn't have any diagnosis of autism, and then they took a group of kids with autism. And they took those blood samples and then they provoked it with the bacteria to see how the immune system responds. And in all the control group, they were fine. But in the group of kids with autism, the immune system did not attack the bacteria the same as it did the control group. And that's as far as the study went, but I just thought it was kind of interesting because if somebody has a disease like Lyme disease, again, your immune system is completely compromised because it's fighting off the bacteria and it can't fight off the other bacteria as it's infected. This was another interesting study. This was done looking at autoimmune disorders. And autoimmune disorders, and you can kind of see up there, and this was taken from the Mayo Clinic. If you look at the symptoms of autoimmune disorders, they're almost exactly the same as Lyme disease. And again, autoimmune disorders is another one of those things that we have no idea what causes it, and there's no cure. And it's kind of when the body is attacking itself. And there's even some Lyme doctors who believe that Lyme disease can provoke an autoimmune response. Well, anyway, in the study, they just looked at, again, some control patients, and then they looked at a group of kids with autism, and they looked at their family history. And in the control patients, they didn't find any cases of autoimmune disease in the family history. But when they looked at the patients that had autism, they found out there were numerous cases of autoimmune disease reported in the family. And then when they found more cases of autoimmune disorders in the family tree, they found more cases of autism. And so that was just another link there. Okay, now this is where, and it kind of, as I was going through my research, I went through those first ones, and I kind of thought, this is interesting, this is very, very interesting stuff, but it's kind of still circumstantial. It's still kind of like, I don't know what my professor's going to think about this. I don't know how strong this link is going to be when I present it. But then I found these next two studies, and this is where I really almost fell out of my chair when I found this stuff. This was an MRI study, and these were two separate studies that had no connection whatsoever. I just found this with hours and hours searching on PubMed online. And these, again, are peer-reviewed medical studies published in medical journals. One was they took a group of Lyme disease patients and control patients, and they did an MRI study of their brain. And what they found were these things called white matter hyperintensities. And white matter hyperintensities are unusual white patches that show up on the MRI, and they associate injury to the brain. It's been associated with cognitive decline and dementia. And when they looked at the Lyme patients compared to the control patients, a large number of the Lyme patients had these white matter hyperintensities, but none of the control patients did. Then in a completely separate study, they did the exact same thing, but they were looking at kids with autism compared to control patients. And the kids with autism, about 50% of them came back with these white matter hyperintensities, and the control patients had none at all. Now, I thought that was very interesting for a couple reasons. One, that these same abnormalities were showing up, and they were showing up in the exact same area, which was the temporal lobe. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. But then the other thing that I thought was kind of interesting was that only about 50% of the kids with autism had these abnormalities. Because again, one of the things I want to keep repeating is I do not think that all kids with autism have Lyme disease, but I think there is a significant amount that do. So that was interesting that about 50% of it showed up. And this is just a picture from that study. This was a kid with autism, and this is a kid without. I'm not going to pretend to be a doctor and tell you exactly, where those areas at, but I mean this was taken directly from the study, and I just put it on there. Now here's the other study that I thought was really, really interesting. This was a SPEC study, and that scan, it looks at the active brain. It kind of looks at blood flow through your brain, kind of looks at all the different things firing around inside your brain. And again, these were two separate studies. One was a group of Lyme patients and control patients, and then one was a group of kids with autism and control kids without autism. And the exact same thing showed up, except this is a different thing because this is a different test. They found a significant amount of hypoperfusion. And what that is when there's a lack of blood flow to a certain part of any organ. With this case, it was a part of the brain. And hypoperfusion can cause permanent cellular damage. Well, again, in the patients with Lyme disease and then the patients with autism, it was that temporal lobe, again, where they found hypoperfusion. So here we have two completely different studies, well, two sets of two different studies, where they're finding, when they looked at the brain, that individuals with Lyme disease and individuals with autism had these abnormalities in the temporal region of the brain. And again, here's just a picture from those studies. Now, when I looked up information about temporal lobe damage, I again about fell out of my chair, because here are the 9 kind of agreed upon presentations that people have when they have temporal lobe damage. Okay, number one, disturbance of auditory sensation and perception. Now, that is very, very, very common with kids with autism. I know with my son, there was a time where we almost thought he was deaf. We would yell at him and be 2 feet away from him, and he was just like off in his own world. And he would walk off, and there could be the house could be burning down, and he's just kind of off in his own world. One of the classes that I took for my master's, we had to create what was called a sensory diet. And what it was is you had to look at the child's symptoms and see if the kid was oversensitive or undersensitive for different things, vision, hearing, with touch. And again, those are all major problems with people with autism. They have all sorts of sensory issues. The other one, disturbance of the selective attention. That's a big thing with autism. And sometimes kids with autism, they can just get focused in on something and they can't get off it, but then other times it's very hard to get their focus. Disorders in visual perception, and that might not be so much of a link, but disturbance of language comprehension. Now, like what I mentioned earlier, that is one of the main 3 things with autism is communication issues, and that is a big problem with people who have temporal lobe damage. Altered personality and affective behavior, and that's a big one with autism, obviously it's a behavior disorder. Dramatic effect on individual personality, and then the last one I thought was really interesting, pervasive behaviors. And pervasive behaviors are almost kind of like, I don't like to use the word obsessive compulsive because kids with autism really don't have obsessive compulsive. It's more like their things that they're stuck on soothe them. But it's sometimes looked at as an obsessive compulsive thing because people who truly have obsessive compulsive issues, it's like they worry about those things. But it can sometimes be looked at and be thought of as a pervasive behavior, because that's what pervasive behavior is when you just have to do those things over and over again for it to kind of feel normal. But those are, and these are the diagnostic criteria for autism disorder, and you can see how a person that would have a temporal lobe damage would match up with some of those same criteria for autism. Okay, now here's another interesting one. Kids with autism, very frequently, almost every kid that I've came across that has autism, self-stim. And that means like hand flapping, toe walking, things like that. And doctors have no idea why. They always just kind of chalk it up to that sensory dysregulation. Well, people who have Lyme disease also have some of those same problems. They don't stim like that, but they have a symptom called paresthesia. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, but I think that's right. And that's a tingling sensation in their fingers and toes. I mean, how many of you guys have ever experienced that? I mean, I know many people who have Lyme disease have experienced that. So, I mean, this was kind of just my connection. I include this in my study. Imagine you have this kid with autism who has a communication problem and can't tell you what's wrong with them. They can't tell you that their hand hurts. They can't tell you that their toes hurt. They can't tell you that they have this tingling sensation. And what are they going to do? They're going to go like that. I mean, think about any time you've sat on your hand and your hand was asleep. What do? You go like that. And this, okay, go ahead, Lori. So I had a Lyme disease physician poll his patients, and he polled 644 of them. And 73.6% of his patients came back and said they experienced that paresthesia. And then they also said 25% of them said that after they were treated with antibiotics, their symptoms resolved. And 42% said it got better. Now, this is one of the things that made me a believer and why I really started this study. My son Tristan, who is this